16. Keep, hope people will probably be popping in and out. I have no idea how this is going to work.
I'm going to keep an eye on it for you, Stewart, and hopefully.
Okay. Now I lost my train of thought, doggone it. We're going to start with some material from, and virtually all of the photos that you're going to see are in the book I did a couple of years ago called Playa Fire. A couple new ones, but for the most part, it's all there. And I know that most of you are very familiar with Burning Man, but there's going to be some people who aren't. And so we're going to start at the beginning. I'm not going to start right at Baker Beach. We'll get back to Baker Beach, but I'm going to start with the first trip that Brian and I, my son Brian, and I have made Burning Man sort of a yearly adventure going back to 1989. But we're going to start with the road to Black Rock City. And I'm going to read a very, very short, I'm not going to do much reading today, but I'm going to read a very short piece from the book that talks about driving to Black Rock City from Portland. The 10-hour journey from Portland, Oregon to northern Nevada is more than a long transition from a city to barren plain. It's a prolonged meditation on shedding the comforts and restrictions. I'm hearing music.
Stewart Harvey's talk about.
That's Trish. Trish, you should
mute yourself, Trish. Maybe.
This live?
I'm hearing music.
They're doing a Zoom right now?
It's a talk. Stewart Harvey is doing a talk.
Hey, Michael, if you're the host here, you might have people.
I mean, are we muted?
I'm working on that. Yeah, before you came on, I asked everybody to mute themselves, so we're kind of waiting.
Do you have the ability to mute?
I can.
Michael, I think you as the host can mute everyone, and then you can unmute Stewart.
Yeah, and I've pretty much done that.
But it didn't work? Because I was hearing things. Are we okay?
Okay, you should be able to go ahead now, Stewart.
Okay, I'm going to start over. I'm sorry. The 10-hour journey from Portland, Oregon to northern Nevada is more than a long transition from a city to barren plain. It's a prolonged meditation on shedding the comforts and restrictions of urban life and embracing existence on an ancient plain. By the time the rhythmic arcs of field sprinklers bordering tiny Eagleville, California, disappear from the rearview mirror, you have departed the realm of farm to table and entered a barren terrain old as the jagged ridges of the Sierra foothills, of the Nevada foothills. Here the roadway winds through miles after miles of arid sage, a haven for coyotes, meandering cattle, and the occasional suicidal jackrabbit. Far beyond the arid acres of sagebrush shimmers the silvery alkaline remains of prehistoric bodies of water. And that is where Brian and I are headed. We had been hearing about Burning Man since my brother started it with Jerry James in 1986. And I'll return to that in a second. But our first real introduction to Burning Man happened on the first trip to the playa in 1990. We had been given coordinates, and basically we had to find a gate. And once we found the gate, the instructions were drive due east for 6 miles, and then turn due north for 4 miles. That meant that one of us had to drive and the other had to look at a compass and the odometer. I don't know if anyone else has ever tried this, but what happens when you're driving with a handheld compass is that the needle goes back and forth. And so you're never quite sure that you're heading due east or due north, but you're very aware of the fact that if you deviate a half a degree, you're going to miss the whole thing. We drove along for, 15, 20 minutes. I don't know. It loves the speed. I mean, the playa just, invites speed. So you're driving pretty fast, and occasionally you run into a windrow of dust, and then you have to slow down. Finally, off in the distance, we saw this odd drum kit, which seemed to be at first out in the middle of nowhere. And then we realized was at the perimeter of this tiny little camp. And that first camp on the playa was about 100 people. Most of them were members of the Cacophony Society, and I'll get to them in a minute. It was a small camp, hippie camp. Jan, you were there. Most of them knew one another. Brian and I were the strangers. Most of them had been Burning Man supporters from the beginning, and they came out. A lot of them, was a caravan that Michael led from San Francisco. So almost all of them were Bay Area people. Very nice, guitar strumming hippies for the most part. My first sighting of the Burning Man, and this was the Burning Man that Larry had envisioned. He and Jerry James had tried to build a Burning Man for about 4 years, and they could never quite get it the way Larry wanted it. Finally, this iteration was what he was after when he originally designed it. And ironically, the man hasn't changed in 30 years. He essentially looks the same, except for 1 year when he got, the last couple years they've played with his shape a bit. Dan Miller was the guy with the video camera, and we were playing dueling cameras for a while. Dan was Larry's roommate. So this was very much a friends and family kind of feeling. My brother had started Burning Man in 1986 with a phone call. He called his friend Jerry James, who was a carpenter, and he said, let's build a man and take it to Baker Beach and burn it on solstice. And this was about 2 days before solstice, so they set about cobbling together this humanoid figure. And I got these pictures from Jerry. It didn't look like much, I mean, being critical. It was every bit something that you would put together in a hurry. But it functioned marvelously. They took it down to Baker Beach and they jammed his feet into the sand. He stands about, I don't know, maybe 7 feet. He's not very tall. The remarkable thing, Larry said, was that when they set him on fire, they immediately drew a crowd. Everybody that was within eyeshot ran over, and they were transfixed by this image of a blazing humanoid figure on the shore. And this is a rumor. Larry denies it. Jerry kind of thought it happened, but supposedly, as they were leaving the beach, Larry turned to Jerry and said, if we do this again next year, let's build him bigger. Now, Larry says that's an apocryphal story, but I like believing it. By the time Brian and I went down in 1989, it would have been the 4th year of Burning Man. And he'd gotten considerably bigger. He was about 20 feet at that point. He had been built, I believe, Jan, in your garage that year. And Larry and Jerry struggled with the design and economy. They didn't really have much funding. So the man ended up being large and very heavy. And Jerry had a lot of friends who were carpenters. And all the carpenters had these rigs on the back of their pickup trucks to haul lumber. And so they enlisted 7 pickup trucks, and they put the man in 7 parts onto the back of the pickup trucks. And then, because this was strictly a guerrilla activity, they took 7 different routes to get to Baker Beach. By the time we got to Baker, we're hauling these hunks of the man down the trail, and you can see that torso weighs a ton. We're right at the I guess the north end of Baker Beach. It's sort of the nude beach area, I think, but there were way too many tourists, I think, for the nudists that day. So the first Burning Man, you know, was really in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge. They assembled him on the shore. 2 things I think are remarkable already about Burning Man. First of all, it is a collaborative effort. You don't build this kind of figure and are able to raise it without a crew. And so there was already this instant community of participants who helped put the man together, and you know, they were going to raise him in a particularly singular way. They're right at the bottom of these 2 feet, I guess, are 2 holes. And the idea was they were going to put 20, 30 people on the end of a line, and they were going to drag the man forward, which would drive the feet into the holes, and then they would leverage him erect. It was a dicey idea, and I was skeptical that they could do it. But I took one look at my brother, and I realized that determination was behind this entire adventure. And I've seen that look dozens and dozens of times over the years. And I realized that if it was possible for it to happen, Larry was going to make it happen. Unfortunately, the physics of the situation came into play. They got the man. There were a group of people who would push him up, and another large group on the end of the rope. He got about halfway up, and either a leg broke first or the rope broke first, but the rope and the leg broke. The man came crashing down. The head went wonky, and one of the legs was severed at the kneecap. What they ended up doing was breaking the other leg, pushing the man up into a seated position, and he burned beautifully. What I took away from watching the man burn was that it was a basically riveting moment. There was something that, you know, the crowd went from raucous to hushed. Their attention was riveted on this figure, and Brian and I ended up leaving feeling like we'd seen something extraordinary. We did not know what it was, but we knew that somebody else's phone's on. But we knew that we'd seen something extraordinary. The following year, Larry and the group went to Baker Beach, and the word had gotten out. Baker Beach was part of the Presidio in those days, and that meant that it belonged to the Army. And when they got there with their parts of the man, the police were there, the fire department was there, and the army was there. And there was a big conflab, and there were about, what, Jan, maybe 1,000 people there? I don't know. There were a lot of people. And they had a big powwow, and it was decreed that they could erect the man, but they could not set him on fire because they didn't have any burning permits. They didn't have any permission to set him on fire. It almost caused a riot. People were yelling and screaming, and it was a tense time. But Larry stuck to his guns. He had agreed not to burn the man, and so they did not burn him. They took him away, and but even at that moment, some of the Cacophony friends that were probably the mainstay, and Cacophony is a group that that supported Burning Man. They were a renegade group of, that's where John Law and Michael and some of those early burners came from, they came up, and Miss P told me this story, P. Siegel. They were saying, let's take him to the zone. We'll take him to the zone. Supposedly Larry didn't really hear that. He just looked at him and said, huh? But the year before, a group of Cacophony people, and Jan, I think you were part of this too, went to an event on the Black Rock Desert that was called Yagata Regatta. And it was wind sailors. And they made a wind sailing, art-driven wind sailing craft. And when Kevin came back, Kevin Evans, he told the group that he had found the perfect place for a zone trip. And one of the things that the Cacophony Society did, which was these different kinds of events, was that they would do an occasional zone trip, which was inspired by Tarkovsky's movie Stalker. And it was about this group of wanderers who went to a strange place where anything could happen. And so the folks around Larry during this debacle were saying, let's take him to the zone. Let's take him to the zone. And so 3 months later, a group of about 100 people led by Michael and John Law and my brother, and then Brian and I came down for it, took the Burning Man to the zone, which was the Black Rock Desert. And after they assembled with the man, and I can't remember the drummer's name. They used a drum call to pull people in to attend the event. So this was our first year on the Black Rock Desert. It was a typical kind of Cacophony thing. People showed up wearing costumes, and that was always a Cacophony tradition. You did these events, you got dressed up for these events, and so very early on, this concept of participation was imbued in the Burning Man experience. And that was the first, I think, notable feature of the event. And it led to what eventually became the 10 principles. And participation's one of the 10 principles. Stuart Mangrum, who was an early Cacophony guy and an active member of the Burning Man organization, once told me, he said, well, most of the 10 principles were in effect with Cacophony, with the exception of civic responsibility. Civic responsibility was never a Cacophony thing. People gathered around in small groups and they were absolutely transfixed. And that's when we realized that this magnetic attraction that people have for fire would drive people to want to attend. There's just nothing like the crescendo that happens. And today the crowds have gotten larger, but the effect is essentially the same. The next year we went back and we burned the man again in exactly the same way. And in the foreground, since Jan's here, I'll bring up the fact that there are these little loaves of bread. And Jan and some of her friends had decided that, female friends, I say, that the Burning Man was entirely too male-centered and that there needed to be a feminine presence. And so what they did was they built an oven, kind of a kiva oven, and they baked loaves of bread. And just before the burn, they went and passed out chunks of bread for the, which is, very, again, kind of a spiritual thing to do to the crowd. It didn't occur after that. It was kind of a one-time thing. I think as the crowds grew, the idea of doing thousands of loaves of bread was probably too daunting. But it's an interesting, it was an interesting addition, and I love the fact that it's part of the foreground of this picture.
Stewart, you might mention they were goddess breads.
Oh, that's right. They were goddesses. What were they? They didn't look like goddesses, though.
Yeah, we made little goddess figures out of dough. They were really
perfect. Perfect. Oh, well, I loved it. I never forgot it. Tasted great too. The effect of the playa on my brother was incredible. He took one look at this vast expanse and his imagination just leaped. For once, he was in a place where he could conceivably realize his big ideas. And my brother was a guy who had big ideas. And he knew, and he told me, in fact, we used to run back and forth in those first years we'd go to Gerlach if we needed more beer, or we needed, somebody had forgotten something, and we could just leave. There was no gate, no perimeter in those early days. And we'd drive to Gerlach. And I remember going to Gerlach with Larry in one of those early years. And I'm his older brother. So I'm kind of wondering in the back of my mind what my brother's going to be doing for the rest of his life, as a career. And I said, not too sarcastically, how long do you think you're going to be doing this Burning Man thing? And Larry looked at me with that look that we all know. And he said, we're just getting started. It turned out they were just getting started. I don't know that he envisioned Black Rock City way back in that first year, but it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't. Nowadays, there's probably an average of 70,000, more or less. That number goes up and down depending on what day of the week it is. But it's a magnificent collection of folks from around the world. I'm going to start looking at a series of photographs that I broke into different groups because these are the things that attracted me. After the first couple of years, I realized that I didn't want to be the chronicler of Burning Man. I really didn't want to be doing journalism. I wanted to be making photographs that spoke to me. And the first thing that spoke to me and almost every other photographer that goes there is the playa itself. It is an absolutely magnetic and ever-changing physical phenomenon. The weather can be incredibly volatile. It can be, hot and unforgiving. It's not, the playa isn't where you want to walk around barefoot for very long. It gets pretty warm. Um, when it rains on the playa, it rains. And in 1995, we had a series of gigantic rainstorms that came through. And this one looks for all the world like an atomic explosion. And it just poured. And what happens when it rains hard on the playa is everything comes to a standstill. Bike tires get 6 inches thick and stop. Everybody's walking around in Frankenstein shoes. And clothing is absolutely in the way, because every time you touch something muddy, you got a big clod on your elbow. It did not take people long before they got rid of the clothing. And so nudity, which is kind of was a hallmark of Burning Man for a number of years, it's kind of diminished now, really got started in 1995 with rainstorms. And people just took off their clothes and slid in the mud and gave one another mud baths and basically had a ball. Every day is different. As a photographer, every morning I go out at sunrise, because no two sunrises are ever alike. Even boring ones are not alike, but there are very few boring sunrises. There's always something going on in that sky. At night, sometimes there's circular lightning, not often, but it's happened. This was 93, very early on. My first playa dust storm, right after this, this was right after the man went down and people are cavorting, and we got hit on the way back to camp with just blinding whiteout. And I had never experienced, the first 3 years we hadn't experienced it, but it's become something that is a yearly reality almost now. The dust creates a fantasy world, and the relationships between figures and some of the sculptural items becomes quite mythic, really. People appear out of the mist. It just changes your feeling, and I relate to that. So I tend to go out and photograph when the elements are at their worst, because that's when the photography seems to be its most evocative. The couple, this reminds me about how it looks across the street from me right now with all the smoke. And there's part of me that feels like it's, the photography, talking about photography is a pretty frivolous thing to be doing in the face of all these fires and the tragedy that several people are experiencing. And at the same time, I realized that we've always had this, and I say we, I mean humanity, has always had this ambivalent relationship with fire. It scares the hell out of us. It can destroy us, it can kill us. But it's also a central part of a lot of spirituality. It's a warm part of our youth when we think about sitting around the campfire when we're kids, when we think about sitting at the fireplace waiting for Santa. I mean, fire is just, we really just have this ambivalent and really pretty magical relationship with it. So right now we're in the middle of a really tragic series of Western fires. And I feel terrible for people. I have friends who've had to evacuate. But I'm also mindful that fire is an integral part of the human experience. And the playa just, it's a magical place to be. One of the fundamentals, one of the reasons people go to Burning Man, I think, and again, it was there at the very beginning, is personal expression. People adopt characters. People get playa names. People perform. People form groups. Participation is the central part of being a burner. There is no audience. And I look at this photograph from 1993. That was declared. No spectators. There is no audience at Burning Man. You are the show. And people at Burning Man embrace that level of participation. And so this series of slides has to do with that. People take on characters. People parade. I think Vic's probably on here somewhere. And the Children of Chaos do a series of parades year after year. The Gold Parade, the Silver Parade, the Illuminated Specters. You know, there's always a reason to get out and participate and give things to one another. That's part of the Burning Man tradition. It can be a small parade, but this has been going on forever. People get to be themselves at Burning Man, and that may involve elements of costuming. You get to be their fantasy figure, their superhero. This is a group of Children of Chaos. Both my son and daughter-in-law are part of this group. And Joanna Priestley is one of the charter members of the group. Her and her husband Paul will often come up with these concepts for activities. And these were the looking glass holes. And they all walked around in silver suits and took pictures of people. Sometimes expression at Burning Man is solitary. Sometimes it's great to just go out into bare playa by yourself and commune with that experience and feel your own energy and your own exuberance and celebrate being alive. And that happens as well. Art has been part of Burning Man from the beginning. Arguably, the first artistic piece was the Burning Man himself. And for me, the first performance at Burning Man occurred during the second year. And I was in my tent. It was the middle of the afternoon. I used to go out early and go out late. And then in the middle of the day, I try to get some sleep. But I saw this woman walking by the tent. And she had all these flowing robes on, white gossamer kinds of robes. And I saw her heading towards the van, and I grabbed my camera and went with her. It was Crimson Rose. And Crimson, as you'll see later on, was she's one of the Burning Man founders, and she especially founded the Fire Conclave, which is an international group of fire performers, and they'll come from all over the world to perform prior to the burn, in the burn circle. And it's quite an honor to be invited if you're a fire spinner to the Fire Conclave. But she went out there just to do an expressive ballet on the leg of the man, and it was beautiful. And clearly, I think one of the first examples, maybe the first example of performance art at Burning Man. There's another character who's part of the Burning Man organization, Stephen Raspa. And Stephen has been dressing in, this is a kind of a very familiar, his long winding silver encrusted beard is part of this persona that he has been bringing to the playa for years. And he'll utilize anything. In this case, the bone tree, which was one of the very first pieces. Dana Albany, I think, and Flash, I think, helped got the cow bones together and built the bone tree. But interacting with art is part of the deal at Burning Man. I mean, you don't just look at it. You got to climb on it. You got to be part of it. You got to relate to it, because that's part of the deal. That's one of the things I think that distinguishes art at Burning Man from, I'm a member of the Photography Council at the Portland Art Museum, and their art is spelled with a capital A. But at Burning Man, it's a much more dynamic, much more part of life. And there is no sanctity of art at Burning Man. It's just there, and it's overwhelming, and it's huge. It's part of that thing that Larry saw when he went out into the playa and looked at a place where there was unlimited potential. The only thing that stops size is gravity. You know, there's a point where you can't maybe build it big enough, but people keep trying. And big art is is the name of the game. This is one of the best pieces I have ever seen. Marco Cochran, it balanced on 1 foot bliss dance was the name of the figure, and it dominated that year of 2010. I'm blanking on the name right now. Not Michael Christian. Nah, can't think of it, but he does the photo church every year, or some variation on it. And we're going to get to the idea of who is it?
Mike Garlington.
Garlington, yes, Michael. Thank you, Wally. This is a labyrinth. I'm going to give this to Stephen Shibley. He's our backyard architect. He's designing a labyrinth for my backyard. I've wanted to have a labyrinth in our backyard ever since I spent a week with Will Roger at Will and Crimson's house in Gerlach. They have a wonderful big labyrinth in the back of their place. And Will and I would walk it every night at sunset. And it's a magical thing. It's a meditative thing. It's something that I derived great pleasure. And this in 2003, the theme was Beyond Belief. And they actually showcased in these little alcoves all around the man base different aspects of spirituality. And they built this big labyrinth that people would walk daily. This is another of Joanna Priestley's ideas, and Children of Chaos. That's my son Brian, was the only male in the picture, and his wife Naomi next to him. And the women were all wearing sort of 50s style swimsuits, and it was called The Last Summer. And but it's another one of these little pageants that just kind of pops up. You know, people randomly deciding to do a performance, unscheduled, and for whoever walks by. People interact with art at Burning Man. Yeah, a lot of times they dance around it. There's almost always some art car nearby that's blasting music, and so it's impromptu dancing is universal there, particularly at sunrise. Sometimes it's an individual thing. You just interact with the art in a way that feels right. This was Lord Snort, Brian Tedrick's piece. and the people were riding it all day long. This group used it as a place to observe the burning of the pyramids. I can't remember what the pyramids were called right now. One of my favorite all-time, it's a mutant vehicle, but it's also a living sculpture and a piece of fire art, El Pulpo Mecánico. And again, I'm forgetting, they're from Texas too. Can't think of the guy. Wally will probably think of that. Who is it?
Dwayne Flatmo.
Yeah, Flatmo. Yeah.
He must have lived in Mexico these days.
It's a fantastic piece. It's just one of my all-time favorites. It's so machine shop, just like we're gonna take all these things that we found and we're gonna build something spectacular with it. And I dearly love this piece. There's another Children of Chaos portrait, illuminated specters. Nighttime at Burning Man is in a whole nother universe, and everybody's aglow. This is a small section on just being on the playa, called it Life on the Playa. And the thing about walking around on the playa is you never know what you're going to run into. There's so many people and so many activities. And literally, when I come back from Burning Man these days, I realize that I've probably not seen more than 1% of what's there to see. I mean, there's so much. You saw that big horseshoe of the city, and 70,000 people. Every one of those camps is doing something. Every single one of those camps is putting on a party, or they're dressing up, or they're performing. You can walk around that city and see 1,000 different things, and you walk around the next day and you'll see 1,000 different ones. It's a lifestyle. It's not always raucous. Sometimes it's kind of peaceful. People stay up all night, and then in the morning they watch the sunrise, they whoop and they holler, and then they go home and go to bed. And there's nothing like 10 o'clock for time to go to bed. There's all these little parades, the parade of the bunnies and the peas and the carrots, and this was the dude abides, and you just don't know what's going to go on. A little smattering of things happening all at the same time. The DPW, that's the Department of Public Works for those non-burners, build a city, and they're a raucous bunch of renegades and hooligans and just generally ornery people, and they work their tails off building the city, and then they love to heap derision on the people stupid enough to show up. And so the DPW parade is hilarious. They parade around, and they cuss out the spectators and tell them to go home. Get away from my Black Rock city. I built this. It's hilarious. The art cars, there's art cars everywhere. This is an early one, and I think it's from Portland. I think I've seen this 2 or 3 times in the city. But this is a Texas-style art car, and those were the first ones. The Houston Art Cars Festival is legendary, and a Houston-style art car is any old, usually big American 70s car with all kinds of stuff super glued onto it. That's the essence. Nowadays, the art cars are big and lavish and built with hundreds of thousands of dollars. But so they're more, a house, a car, a giant dragon, that sort of thing. I kind of bemoan the loss of the little mama papa art car, you know, the little golf cart inspired, you know, put all your stuff on top of it and paint it and drive it around kind of vehicle. The city itself is a piece of art. This is a center camp one year, and in the center camp every night and every day there are people performing. So there are empty stages, people rehearse in center camp, people drink coffee in center camp. And there's always a couple of stages where people, one after the other, go out and perform just for the sake of performing. On Friday night, they have the Battle of the Marching Bands. This, I think, is March 4th from Portland. But they'll usually have 3 or 4 really good bands. And they will have a contest to see who's going to be the best band. One of my favorite things, and this has been out there, I'm sure at least since the movie, right? Thunderdome has been and I think it's sponsored by DPW. I think they're the ones behind Thunderdome. But they've been doing this for years. People flock onto the structure so they can look down on these combatants, male and female, by the way, all armed with, they're on these slings that help them to bounce around and make it hard to keep your balance. And then these big padded, I don't know, what do you call them? Whack-a-mole thing. And anyway, they beat the tar out of one another and have a grand old time. Sacred space. I think the single biggest change in Burning Man occurred in the year 2000, 2001. David Best, a good friend and a great artist, came to Burning Man and built a temple in his camp to memorialize a friend that had died, who was actually supposed to be with him. And Larry and others saw this little, and it was not big, temple. And they had plans for the following year. The theme for the following year was going to be the 7 ages of man, and it was going to go from birth to death. And so they commissioned David to build what was called at that time the mausoleum. And the mausoleum, he since renamed it the Temple of Tears, but it was called the mausoleum then. I said it had all the charm of Attila the Hun, but because it had all these horns and stuff all over it. But it became something that people instinctively flocked to like a magnet, and they did what came natural when you go into a memorial space. You leave memorials. And by the end of Burning Man, the temple will be absolutely filled with memorials, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. I think the lamplighters are they're sort of the priests of the playa. They remind me of Tibetan monks. They go out faithfully twice a day to light, to hang lanterns on the spires, and then they go out in the morning to collect the lanterns. And that's how people navigate around. They know where the roads are because they follow the lights. And they go out in every kind of weather. They are like the postman. No one dissuades them from their rounds. This is Ken Hamazaki, a person I consider a friend. He would come out, I think every year since about 2000, Ken, who's an artist in Kyoto, comes out and sets up on Thursday at 4 o'clock of burn week and does tea ceremony. Anybody who wants to attend. And when we had Larry's memorial in 2018, David and I went out with, and I'll show you some of that later on. David and I went out early to set things up. About 4 o'clock went out, and sure enough, there was Ken had set up in front of the memorial and was doing the tea ceremony, and I participated in the tea ceremony with Ken in front of Larry's memorial, and it was a touching moment for me. This is one of David's, not constructed yet, kind of in mid-construction. Some of the temples are magnificent. I mean, it's the Temple of Transition, and I can't remember where these guys were from. They were not, they were from Europe someplace, but I don't remember where. The interior of the temple, this is one of the Davids, which are usually very ornate, but they'll be filled with, the altar area will be filled with memorabilia. The walls will be filled with memorabilia. Every surface will contain personal messages. Sometimes it's just something scrawled on the wall, but sometimes it's something incredibly touching. I can remember seeing a Boy Scout shirt hanging, and you knew this story without being told. Loss and grief are integral parts of the human condition. It's the one thing that we all share. People can attain all kinds of wealth and stature, but grief is common to all men, and that sorrow at losing a loved one permeates. And I think this was the greatest contribution to Burning Man was David Best building the temple, and I think it's the thing that, and we'll see this in a second, that allowed Burning Man its access to the rest of world culture. This is the burn itself becomes a sacred space. The morning after the burn, people come and walk through the ashes and pick through the ashes, and I guess they're maybe looking for souvenirs, but they're also mourning the loss of this experience. It's the denouement. It's the end of Burning Man, and they feel it. The last sacred space is the biggest one of all. It's the playa itself. And ever so often, a person will feel compelled to just go out in the middle of vacant playa and sit down and contemplate a world much larger than themselves. It's one of the reasons that the playa is so important to Burning Man is this immense connection with the universe. I mean, this is where you feel and experience your place, your small, tiny place in the world. Okay, for those of you who think I never take a color picture, this is a series. You can't do fire without color. I mean, it looks ridiculous in black and white. There's Crimson. Crimson started the Fire Conclave way back when. They perform prior to the burn. It's worldwide. There are conclaves all over the world of fire performers. It's an early one. the experience of pyro is what gets people all fired up at the burn. This scared the hell out of me. I have been to the burn circle many times, but they had this explosion, which has now kind of become routine. That was the first one I'd ever seen, and I thought I was gonna die. The art, a lot of the artwork. This is the Flaming Lotus Girls serpent. Serpent Mother is called. There are a lot of flaming sculptures. A lot of sculptures are made for night. Some are made for day, and the best ones work both ways. This was one from just 2 or 3 years ago. Medusa Madness, and the eyes were animated. This was the year that of the big Burning Man. They made a man much larger than he'd ever been. Took forever to burn. They said they'd never do it again. But if they did for the first time, and it's starting to become a thing, that for the first time the man deviated from that classic build, which had been done, some 25 years earlier. He called us Exploding Hearts, and it was happening. It was the night that Will and Crimson got married, and some of their friends, some pyro friends, had set this explosion to go off, and I was taking a picture of the wedding party and everyone walking out to the playa. They'd said something's going to happen, and so they were walking out, and I'm backing away from them, and someone ran up to me and said, "You need to get the hell out. There's going to be an explosion." I turned around and took about 2 steps backwards, and it went off. And fortunately, my finger worked and got the moment. This was the pyramid that lightning and sin were involved in, and what my memory of it is that it was one of the hottest fires that I can remember, and I was there. We were pretty close, and I was getting fried, and this is another one that was really a hot one, but I turned around from that pyramid fire, which was the Temple of Holiness, I believe, with a WH. And I took a picture of the crowd behind me, and I realized I wasn't the only one that was being fried in that light. Oops. Kind of a parting shot of Larry. My brother passed away in 2018. We'd go into the burn circle together almost every year. Sometimes we'd have other people in an entourage, but a lot of times it was just him and I. We'd go out in his golf cart, and this photograph was just, I saw the look on his face, and I saw him reliving the past 30 years. And I think he was pleased. Our father was a carpenter, and Larry and Dad didn't always get along. Dad didn't understand Larry at all. But he once asked me, he said, "What do you think Dad would have thought of Burning Man?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if he would have understood it, but I know he would have been proud that you made something so magnificent out of wood, because Dad made everything out of wood." Now they have memorials to Larry, and he was called the Hat, although he stopped wearing the hat for the last 10 years. he finally decided he didn't need to wear the hat anymore. I think Burning Man achieved a lot of what Larry was after, but I think if he were still alive, there's a lot more he would like to have achieved. I think the thing that reached out, and David and I have had this conversation, I think the thing that reached people around the world, though there are burn events, there are at least 35 that I know of, burn events that happen all around the world. There's Africa burn, and there's mid-burn in Israel. And so burns themselves are something that have been embraced by a world culture. But something that I think on a personal level has proven to change my perception of Burning Man was going to Ireland in 2015 with David. We're about to wrap this up for you people getting nervous. There was a group called the Artichoke out of London that they do a series of events. And most of you know that Derry, Ireland, or Londonderry, as some Brits prefer, was sort of ground zero for what was called the Troubles in the early 80s. There were, there still are many remnants. And the essence of the Troubles is one country taking over another, but it broke along religious lines. And so there's been animosity between, in Northern Ireland in particular, between the British Protestants and the Irish Catholics. And when David invited me to come to work on a temple that they were commissioned to build in Derry, and I agreed, imagining that I was there to take pictures and document the event. And so I got off the bus I flew into Belfast, had to take a coach over to Derry. And I got off and I had to take a car across the River Foyle, which separates the three sections of Derry. And so there's the city side, which is the downtown area. And then there's the water side, which is across the Foyle River. And that's the Protestant side of the river. And then there's the northern sort of kind of the poor section. That's called the Bogside. And the Bogside riots were ground zero for the Troubles in the 80s. And there still are remnants, as you can see in the foreground of this picture, there still are remnants of that conflict. So I got there and got in a cab to go across, and the cabbie looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're one of them Yanks." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, well, it's a fine idea, but they built it in the wrong place." And I said, well, why do you say that? He says, well, listen, that side of the river that we're going to, well, that's the Protestant side of the river. Well, the Catholics aren't going to come over there. But that piece of property up there where you're building that thing, well, that's belonged to an old Catholic IRA family. So the Protestants aren't going to go up there. Nobody's going to come. So that stuck with me during the entire construction of the temple up on this hill. And it was not an easy build. And the first day that I was there, I was taking pictures, documenting the build. Well, you can only take, carpentry is slow, and after an hour, you've taken everything that you can of people hammering nails. So I was talking to one of the fellows that I knew. And the next thing I knew, David Best was in my face. And he's saying, listen, when you're talking to somebody here, neither one of you are getting anything done. And I got the message and picked up a hammer. And so for the first time in my experience at Burning Man, I wasn't there as a photographer. Oh, I'd take a few pictures now and then. But I began to be a participant. And it changed my perception of Burning Man. I didn't realize it, but there's no substitute for being an active participant. There's no substitute for picking up a hammer and lending a hand. And the weather in Ireland was shite. It was terrible. We even had snow one afternoon. And we're slogging around in the mud, and nobody thinks we're going to get done on time. And in the back of my head, I keep hearing this, and nobody's going to come. And so by the time we got to the day of the opening, and the idea was we were going to open on Saturday. And this is a crew picture. David in the foreground and Maggie. And there were about 40 Irish on the crew. And I got to know two of them real well. They were Darmot, the fella in the green cap, and the guy next to him with the horns on his helmet, Darmot. So there was Donnick and Darmot. And they invited me to go on a bit of a walkabout tour, the tour of Ireland. And we ended up going down to Donnick's hometown of Glynn, which is below Galway. And we were gone for a week, and it was a wonderful time. And then we got back on that Friday, and the idea was the temple was going to open on Saturday, and it would be open all week. And of course, while it was open, people did what people instinctively do. They did memorials. And in Ireland, there was a lot of good reason to be doing the memorials. And when we got back, we said, well, let's run up the hill and see what the temple looks like. Well, we couldn't get up the hill. There were thousands of people going up the hill and thousands coming back down. There was no room for cars. And when I got there that night for the burn, there were about 40,000 people that had come from all over the country to see this thing. And it burned magnificently. It was stellar. And that night we went to Sandino's, which was a little pub on the city side that we had kind of taken a hanging out at. And David and Maggie threw a party for the crew. And they left early. David goes to bed early. But it was about 1 o'clock. And there were probably 6 or 7 of us heading back across the bridge to where we were staying. It's St. Colum's house. And just on the other side of the bridge is the Abrington Barracks. And that's where the British soldiers were stationed during the Troubles. And but it was abandoned. It's closed now. And so street kids hang out there. And we're going back across. And the thing in the back of my mind is, we're at the tail end of this. We've put out a big effort. We had a great burn, but you always wonder, did it add up to anything? Was it just a moment and then you move on? Did we touch anybody? Did it matter that we did this? And as we got upwards towards this set of barracks, there was a group of young people there hanging out in the shadows. And you know how it is when it's 1 o'clock in the morning and you're meeting strangers. You're giving them the eyeball, they're giving you the eyeball. And we got up abreast of them, and the most remarkable thing happened. they broke into applause. And that's when I knew that we had touched them, that we had made a difference. Because if the young people pay attention, then it may stay with them. I got back, and I was a temple builder from then on. And it's changed my relationship with the event. I like to say that I've been going to Burning Man for 30 years, but I didn't really get Burning Man until I went to Derry, Ireland. And so this was the last time I saw my brother. It was the opening of a Burning Man exhibit at the Renwick in Washington, D.C. And David, you can always recognize David. He always wears a white shirt and jeans. That's his uniform. Paulie in the wheelchair. The crew doesn't change much. We know each other every time we go. They've been with him, many of them, for years and years. We built the temple interior, and it was a lot of work, and it was very rewarding. And then last spring, a year ago, in 2019, we went to Parkland, Florida, and we built a temple in Parkland, Florida, for the students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School, where the shooting occurred. And we had a lot of students and their parents that came and were part of the crew. Oops. And it was a great temple, and the entire city embraced it. This year we were supposed to go back to Ireland, to Galway, and build a temple, and it got canceled because of the pandemic. But I'm hopeful next year we'll get to go. And it burned great. The last burn occurred in 2018, and that was for Larry. We went to David Best's place in Petaluma, and we built this thing. Jan was there. A great number of the temple crew came and participated in building a smallish but very personal memorial for Larry. And just as it was, Crimson lit the fire, and just as it was getting going, Tristan, who's Larry's son, and Dante, Larry's stepson, came busting out of the crowd and made straight for the memorial, and they put one of Larry's hats on the thing, and that was their contribution, and it was thoroughly appropriate. And this is Kate Rodenbush's portrait of, or part of an installation that she did that year. And I thought it was fitting to end the show with another picture of Larry and a promise for a brighter day and a brighter future. And I wish that for all of us. Thank you very much.
That was fabulous.
There we go. I'm unmuted, everyone. If you'd like to applaud, I think that was an excellent show.
Yay!
Thank you very much, Stuart. Okay, everyone should be unmuted, so rather than butting in on everybody, if you have any questions or comments, it would be wonderful.
You don't have to.
You don't have to. Any questions?
Okay. Most of these folks have been there and done that, and they know everything about what I just said. And I just want to say it's great. It's great to connect virtually, and next year, hopefully, physically.
Awesome.
Hey,
Okay.
this is Karen, a friend of Janet's, and she tuned me into this, and I just think it was an amazing talk and amazing photos. Thank you. I've not really seen that much of Burning Man, so it's really great for someone who doesn't know anything about it.
Well, get down there. You'll that's the next step is see a picture, do the picture.
Yeah. Thank you.
There have been a lot of chat comments about the fabulous show, and thank you, Stewart, and so on. So there's been a lot of feedback that wasn't shared verbally, Stewart. You much appreciated, obviously.
And
Just
Stewart,
to mention to folks too that we have a show of his photos at the Emerald Arts Center in Springfield. We're
Yeah, get on
Wednesday
over
through
there.
Saturday, 11 to 4. Weather and smoky air permitting, we were closed this past week, but we're going to have a closing reception on September 25th from like 5 to 7 or so. So if you're in Springfield, stop by.
And Stewart, this is Sin. I was going to say I have your book, which I've read. It's out in my living room. And I camped with you for 20 years. And you're quite the storyteller like Coyote. And I learn something new every time. And I love this last part about the transformation to the temple builder. And it was just a beautiful way to end. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sin, and you guys know what I'm talking about because you've built a wonderful temple. So it's.
I love the picture. I have to get one for you because, believe it or not, I don't have one picture that we have hanging of our temple, and I'll contact you about that. Thank you.
You bet. You bet. Absolutely. Well, are we done, Mike?
I guess we are. Thank you
Okay.
all for
Thank you all.
participating.
Go have a
Thank
happy
you,
Sunday.
Stuart. That was beautiful.
Yep.
It's nice to see everybody.
Really fantastic.
Yep. Don't forget to stop in at Emerald Arts Center by the 25th. It's showing a lot
Thanks,
of great
Steve.
photos up. Goodbye, all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Great session. Thank you.
Hey, Carol.
All right. Thanks, Mike.